All right, so my name is Davis Huffman. This is my presentation. I'm going to start sharing my screen here. All right, nothing but a boom. All right, so this presentation is the Audacity of Barack Obama, subtitled Strengths, Weaknesses, Successes, and Failures. And this is for strategic leadership, the MBA program at the College of Business and Security Management at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Again, my name is Davis Huffman. This is December 14th, 2022. So the contents, first we're going to have our abstract, then we're going to do an overview of the strategic leadership framework. That was found in a piece of literature that we had to read for the class. And then we're going to have an overview of the subject, Barack Obama. A little fast there, but we're going to go into his strengths and his weaknesses, and then his successes and his failures. We're going to look at these within the strategic leadership framework, and especially the 6 essential leadership skills that are identified in that piece. And then hopefully when doing so, we're going to kind of see to what sense he possessed these 6 essential leadership skills, and to what extent he didn't, and how they might have contributed to some of his successes or failures, which will wrap up in the conclusion, and then some references. So the abstract. This is what I wrote here. In a piece for the Harvard Business Review, Shoemaker et al. Identified 6 skills that, when mastered and used in concert, allow leaders to think strategically and navigate the unknown effectively. The abilities to anticipate, challenge, interpret, decide, align, and learn. While assessing the effectiveness and legacy of a president is subject to partisan interpretation, it is possible to identify these 6 essential skills in a given leader and therefore perform an objective assessment of the strategic leadership qualities. Regarding President Barack Obama, this paper attempts to identify his strengths and weaknesses and how they correspond with these 6 essential skills, or the lack thereof. In doing so, these strengths and weaknesses can be used to understand how he came to succeed or fail in certain matters. In the end, the goal of this presentation is to convey a nonpartisan review of Barack Obama's achievements and shortcomings in strategic leadership. A strategic leadership framework, and this is a screenshot from actual piece that we're talking about here. So the first essential leadership skill of the 6 that they identified is anticipate. And the piece of the literature that I think summarized it best would be the authors write. A strategic leader is constantly vigilant, honing the ability to anticipate by scanning the environment for signals of change. And the next skill would be challenge, which they write, strategic thinkers question the status quo, they challenge their own and others' assumptions, and encourage divergent points of view. Only after careful reflection and examination of a problem through many lenses do they take decisive action. Third skill is interpret. As the authors write, is instead of reflexively seeing or hearing what you expect, you should synthesize all the input you have. You need to recognize patterns, push through ambiguity, and seek new insights. Fourth strategic leadership skill is decide. The authors write, in uncertain times, decision makers may have to make tough calls with incomplete information, and often they must do so quickly. Regarding align, they write, strategic leaders must be adept at finding common ground and achieving buy-in among stakeholders who have disparate views and agendas. And then finally, learn. Strategic leaders are the focal point for organizational learning. They promote a culture of inquiry, and they search for the lessons in both successful and unsuccessful outcomes. They study failures to find the hidden lessons. And now we got an overview of Barack Obama. He was born Barack Hussein Obama II on August 4th, 1961 in Honolulu, Hawaii. He spent his childhood in Hawaii and partly in Indonesia, for reasons we'll get into shortly here. His father was Barack Hussein Obama Sr., born June 18, 1934 in what was then British Kenya. He died relatively young in a car accident in Nairobi, Kenya in 1982. And Barack Obama and his father only met once after he was a toddler. He was 10 years old. They met briefly. So he spent most of his childhood, or practically all of his childhood, in the care of his mother, Ann Dunham, who was born November 29, 1942 in Wichita, Kansas, and died also relatively young of cancer, I believe, on November 7th, 1995 in Honolulu, Hawaii. And up here is a picture. This is Ann's father, Barack's grandfather, This is Barack's half sister, Maya, and then this is his mother right here. Of course, she is Barack Obama. Now, a formative figure in Barack Obama's life and the father of his half sister here. Oh, by the way, Ann Dunham was married to Barack's father from 1961 to 1964, but she was married much longer from 1965 from 1980 to Lolo Soetoro, an Indonesian national who was born January 2nd, 1935 in the Dutch East Indies, which is modern-day Indonesia. Also died relatively young, March 2nd, 1987 in Jakarta, Indonesia. And he was married to Barack's mother for 15 years as the father of his younger half-sister, and was a stepfather for quite some time. And Barack actually spent a few years of his childhood living in Indonesia, going to an English language school. Our overview of Barack Obama continues. Now we're going to get into his adulthood. When it comes to his education, after graduating high school in Hawaii, he went to the Occidental College in LA, but he finished his undergrad years with a Bachelor of Arts from Columbia University in New York. And then many years later, he went on to get his law degree from Harvard University. And I believe he was the first African-American editor of the Harvard Law Review while he was a student there. But before he went to law school at Harvard, he worked as a community organizer and also during law school as well. After law school, he was a civil rights attorney, and then he also lectured at the University of Chicago. He was a professor there for many years. So that was his pre-political career, unless you count community organizing, civil rights attorney as kind of political adjacent. And then we got his pre-presidential political career. He first ran for office in 1996, got elected to the Illinois State Senate that year, and started serving in 1997 in the 13th District for the Illinois State Senate. He was there until 2004, and then in 2005, he was elected to the United States Senate, serving as one of the senators from Illinois. He was there for 3 years before moving on to the presidency. He first started getting popular and getting on people's maps after his DNC speech one year. Kind of became a little sensation, a darling of the Democratic Party, and he ran not long after for the presidency. Of course, he won. He's the first U.S. president of color. Some people might say he's the first black president. Joe Biden was his vice president for both terms. He was first elected in 2008, defeating John McCain and his running mate, Sarah Palin. And then he was reelected again in 2012, defeating Mitt Romney and his running mate, Paul Ryan. In a C-SPAN survey that they do, I believe, every year, where they survey a bunch of presidential historians and have them rank the presidents, he was ranked 10th out of 44 in the 2021 survey. The highest approval rating he ever achieved during his presidency was 69%, and the lowest approval rating he ever achieved was 38%. So now we got his post-presidential career. He still lives in Washington, D.C. He and his wife run the Obama Foundation. He makes money doing speaking engagements and is active in the Democratic National Party still, National Convention still. He still campaigns for candidates during Senate. During the midterms, he was just on the campaign trail making speeches for people. And he's still a guiding voice in the Democratic Party, many would say. And then as well as all this, he started Higher Ground Productions with his wife, which is a production company that is working closely with Netflix. They're doing a lot of documentary films, a lot of stuff focused on minority issues as well. So now we're getting into his strengths and weaknesses. And the problem, especially in modern day and age, when you're assessing what people have accomplished, some people could see these things as strengths. Some people can see them as weaknesses. It sometimes could be partisan, something I alluded to in the abstract. So some of these things, I'm going to identify how they could be a strength and as weaknesses. There's things that kind of flow onto both sides of this pendulum. So we're going to get into the strengths first. One of the most noted ones is his calm and collected nature. It's not often to see him upset or irate. He always seemed to be able to keep his cool and never let anything get to him. This would be a strength that when facing obstructionism from the opposite party, Republicans control both houses for I think half of his presidency, or a quarter of his presidency, and then at least one of the houses for half his presidency. So it made things difficult. but it was hard. You were hard pressed to see him get out of line, lose his cool, and say something that many would call a gaffe. Something that his vice president there, Joe Biden, you could say is probably guilty of in some respects. When it comes to education, he has a strength in education that was identified by some authors because of his legal education, his political education. He's very familiar with the mechanizations of the U.S. political system, and this kind of gave him an advantage when maneuvering the obstructionism or the rivalry from other party members, or just trying to get his accomplishments done in a time of adversity. His pragmatism was also noted by many authors. He's noted it's also a weakness by some authors, depending on how you look at it. He's known for kind of finding the middle ground on certain issues. You know, he campaigned on certain things like closing Guantanamo Bay or pulling out of Afghanistan and Iraq, things that didn't really happen. I mean, he pulled out of Iraq, but it was ultimately a failure at the end. We're still active in Iraq. The situation in Iraq is not any better. But some people say that it's a weakness because he compromised on some of his promises. But some people might say that that's a positive, especially if you tend to be more of a centrist rather than strictly Republican or Democrat or liberal or conservative. Another strength, probably his most famous one, would be his oratory skills and his charisma. He seemed to be well liked. Even people who don't agree with his policies seem to find some charm in him. He's able to speak very well, makes memorable speeches. He also likes to write his own speeches a lot, from what I found in my research. He's very fond of writing his own words. So now we're going to get into some of his weaknesses. One of the weaknesses that was kind of recognized on someone who you could say was on the same side of the aisle as him is his power was too centralized. We're going to get into another thing, even outside of just relying on executive orders, within his own executive branch, he seemed to focus too much on his core competency, on his core cabinet members, and kind of neglected some of the administrative roles on the outer end. The author, I think, noted that it took a little longer than it does most presidents to fill out some of his vacancies. And then we're going to get into the next kind of weakness, which is alluded to in the last one, is reliance on executive power. And some people, you could say that this was just a response to not having the legislative support. But again, you could maybe say that a good president would be able to rally up that legislative support or find a compromise with that legislative adversity. But again, he relied a lot on executive power, which would kind of lead into another weakness that we're going to talk about here as the list goes on. It's becoming more and more common these days for a president to rely on their executive power. I think it's called the unitary executive theory. You can read about it more in your free time if you want. It's basically just the idea that the executive branch has grown greater and greater in how much power it holds, and the checks and balances aren't as strong as they used to be. He's too pragmatic. Again, you see pragmatic was on the last one. Some of the people on the same aisle think that he was too compromising on some of his beliefs, or maybe he was too slow and indecisive in the economic recovery, for instance. Reluctance to communicate. So this is something that was brought up by more conservative people. So yes, he did deal with obstructionism and adversity from not having legislative power, but some people on that side of the aisle also feel like maybe he didn't make much of an effort. He kind of just shook it off and dismissed them rather than trying to reach out and communicate and become friendly. So, and as such, this kind of leads to the next one. Too partisan, too focused within. Didn't bring in Republicans enough. Decided, well, to hell with it. I'm just going to focus on what I have, which is this core group of Democrats, and we're going to get done what we can get done just as ourselves, rather than finding a mass consensus. All right, so now we're going to get into Obama's successes and failures. First, we're going to start with his successes. Many authors noted that he did a relatively good job getting us out of the economic crisis of 2008, 2009, Great Recession, some people might know it as. It was relatively stable recovery. Things didn't get worse. We were able to get out of it. Some people might say it was already starting to recover. Some people say that we didn't recover fast enough. But ultimately, in the end, we made ultimately pretty successful recovery, especially compared to countries in Europe and Asia. the U.S. economy still turned out one of the best in the end, if not the best, especially in the most recent years before COVID kind of messed things. I think even in COVID, we're still one of the better economies or sturdier economies. When it comes to civil rights and LGBT rights, he repealed the Don't Ask, Don't Tell bill, which is supported by a lot of people in the civil rights movement, or the LGBT movement. He expanded the amount of protected classes in the federal government to include transgender and LGBT people, and he contributed significantly culturally to advancing the popularity of civil rights in this country, the acceptance of minorities in this country, of LGBT people in this country. Education and student loan reform. Some people might say it's critique again, but student loan reform, he got it out of the hands of private lenders, which kind of at the very least, it protects borrowers from predatory lending practices. You can say what you want about the government owning all that student debt, but at the end of the day, it protects borrowers from predatory practices, and I think that was the ultimate goal of it. Education reform. After the financial crisis, 2008-2009, school budgets across the country were slashed to kind of, to compensate for what we were going through. And then the federal government, as part of Obama's stimulus package, gave, I think, $100 million to schools across the country to help them stay sturdy, to continue to be there for its people, or its students. When it comes to his diplomatic achievements, well, again, some of these could be viewed negatively by others, but we advanced diplomatic relations with Iran. We had an Iran nuclear deal. There's the Paris Climate Accords. There's a lot of leeways made with Southeast Asia, with TPP. A lot of leeways made with Southern American countries, countries like Cuba. There's an increase in diplomatic relations. We had strong ties with the G7 countries and European countries. And then I said earlier, with the Paris Accords, the Paris Agreement, addressing global warming and energy and our energy policy. There's a lot of authors that noted his successes when it came to that. And then his political maneuvering. So his political knowledge, and again, you could say it's a weakness. He did get a lot of things done with executive power, but it was able to accomplish quite a few things for actually only holding the executive branch really for at least 2 years of his 8 years as president. So, so now we're going to get into the failures. One failure, this is one particularly noted from someone on the same side of the aisle as him. And then there are many conservatives who criticize his immigration policy. It depends how you look at it. But some people think some of his immigration policies were hypocritical, while doing things like the Dreamers Act, or also known as DARPA, I believe, allowing childhood migrants to stay here. While at the same time, I think his presidency saw more deportations than any president in history. So some of the people on the same side of the aisle as him, some of the people on the liberal side, is another way to put that, have seen that kind of as a hypocritical nature. Some people on the right side of the aisle, the conservative side of the aisle, think he was too lenient with his immigration policy and are actually against DARPA or Dreamers. Some people have noted that his economic recovery could have been done faster. It was too slow. It almost took his whole presidency before the Fed raised interest rates again. I think it did take his whole presidency. I don't think the Fed ever really raised. Maybe they did once. So the economic recovery was really slow. It wasn't as great as it could have been, as some might argue. A lot of people noted his weak legacy with no lasting change, and this kind of goes back to his reliance on executive power or executive orders. So his successor was able to just come in and change a lot of his policies. The Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy was repealed. I think Dreamers and DARPA was repealed as well, just because he relied on the executive power. Some people say he had to. But in the end, there's no really arguing that his legacy was kind of weak in some regards when it comes to some of his policies and how long they can last. Some noted authors, as mentioned earlier, noted his lack of bridge building with the other side. Again, you could say he had a lot of opposition to build that bridge, but it takes two to tango at the end of the day. And some people say maybe he wasn't even on the dance floor in the first place. One author noted, at least, and I've heard this from other people as well, they perceive that he has a negative view of this country, or at least some of his demographic. There's famous quotes that have made the rounds on Fox News that are gaffes that he's made in speeches where he said things about certain people that aren't inclined to vote for him that were really taken to heart by a lot of people and blasted all over the news screens as a negative message. So some people see kind of an elitist would be the popular word for it. He had almost an elitist view of the country. And then finally, his failed political promises. This is especially on people on his own side of the aisle. He promised to close Gitmo, which never happened. He didn't pull out of Afghanistan. Pull out of Iraq was botched. He promised, I believe he promised universal health care when he was running for president. But of course, the Affordable Care Act is not universal health care by any means. So then we have Obama and the 6 essential leadership skills. So there's the 6 essential leadership skills that we covered earlier, and now we're going to look at how Obama's strengths and weaknesses kind of compare and contrast to those. So first would be anticipate, if you remember. So we have in our left column here, we have our leadership skills, and then we have strengths and successes, and then our weaknesses and our failures, and we're going to try to correlate them all together. So with anticipate, a strength or success when it comes to his ability to anticipate, he was able to advance civil rights to match public opinion. You might remember that when he ran for president, he was actually against gay marriage, but by the time Obergefell versus Hodges came around and gay marriage was legalized across the country, he was an ecstatic supporter. And before that, he had already repealed "Don't Ask, Don't Tell" in the military. So he had shifted his opinion to match public opinion, which would show his ability to anticipate, I believe. Weaknesses and failures. A failure in this regard or a weakness, he didn't anticipate the power of a successor. Or maybe he did, and it was just all he could do, and hope for the best, I suppose. But his reliance on executive power, Donald Trump was able to come in and reverse a lot of his key policies just with the stroke of a pen. Challenge would be the next leadership skill. An example of his strength or success, his pragmatism and his ability to moderate his policies. Some people say it was a weakness because he made these promises during his campaign, but he didn't fulfill them. Some people say that, well, he just moderated his opinion. He came to the middle with the other side. So he challenged his own beliefs. He challenged others' beliefs, perhaps even in his own administration in doing so. A weakness or a failure regarding his ability to challenge himself or others. So people on the same side of the aisle would say that this action, changing his policies once he's in office, is conforming or even unnecessary. Compromise could be disingenuous, which is something we'll get into a little bit later. The next leadership skill would be interpret, and a strength or success in regards to that. Compromise across the aisle brought inroads. So he was able to create healthy relationships with people across the aisle. Probably the most famous one is John McCain, who he defeated to become president. He had a healthy relationship with John McCain in the legislature even. And that might even have to do with the fact that John McCain and Joe Biden had a strong relationship. But he used that to his advantage. He was able to interpret, and you could say even his ability to challenge, where we mentioned earlier, he moderated his policies. That could be a form of interpretation. Weakness and failure in regard to interpretation. People across the aisle, certainly, this is way more than the previous point. People felt alienated by him across the aisle. They didn't feel like he was really trying to reach out to them or understand them or make things work with them. The fourth leadership skill is decide. He certainly showed decisiveness by signing all those executive orders and the political maneuvering he made, getting through the Affordable Care Act, in the first 2 years of his presidency and before he lost power in the legislature. So he definitely showed his ability to decide and act quickly. You'd say the operation to take down Osama bin Laden could be an example of this. The reaction in Libya and Gaddafi could be an example of this, or it could be an example of contrary, saying he decided or acted too brashly. A weakness or failure in regarding the side. Some people would say on his side of the aisle would say he compromised too much, and perhaps he wasn't decisive enough in the economic recovery, and thus it was too slow. Regarding a line, he was able to handle obstructionism relatively well for not having control of Congress for most of his presidency, or he did relatively well and was able to get a lot of accomplishments done. A weakness or failure in this regard, well, he failed to bring bipartisanship. This is something we've already touched upon. He didn't really get the two sides of the House to really agree on too many things while he was president. Um, Again, it came down a lot to what he can do executively or judiciously, even. And then finally, we have learned, and a strength of success when it comes to Obama on this is, he compromised and moderated his more radical policies, as we already kind of mentioned. So he showed his ability to learn. Again, he ran for president, saying he was against gay marriage. By the time gay marriage legalized, he was for it wholeheartedly. And I think even before then was out there, publicly speaking in support of it. Weakness or a failure in regard to learning. While these decisions, his pragmatism, his compromise, some people might say it's a skill. There are certainly others who think it's a sign of weakness or even a sign of disingenuous behavior, because he ran on these lofty promises, and then once he was in office, he was just another politician. So, conclusion. Obama's demeanor, being calm and collected, allowed him to weather some turbulent times in the Great Recession and against Republican obstructionism. His Ivy League education and experience as a civil rights attorney and professor gave him considerable knowledge in the political arena. Because of his political maneuvers, he was able to advance some landmark legislation and policy reforms. His reasonable, pragmatic nature allowed him to seek compromise with the dissenting opposition, advancing economic policies that brought the United States out of recession. And finally, his charisma and oratory skills allowed him to be a powerful and supportive voice for a growing civil rights movement. The following figure, and that'll be on the next slide, shows a visual conceptualization of how the strengths of Barack Obama led to his successes, and conversely, how his weaknesses led to his failures. Regarding his failures, his lack of bipartisanship may have slowed the economic recovery from the Great Recession. His pragmatic nature led to compromises in certain policies that weakened their lasting impact. His short experience in the world of politics may have inhibited his ability to reach across the aisle in finding a compromise, forcing his hand with executive action. His over-reliance on symbolism, i.e. his orations and charisma, may have also contributed to this lack of concrete reform. And finally, his reliance on the power of the Oval Office only went to show his lack of power, as his successor Donald Trump was quick to reverse a handful of his policies. So, conclusion continued, and this is going to be the figure that I talked about. So this figure, so on the left here we have our strengths, which lead into our successes. We're trying to show a direct correlation, and then our weaknesses, which lead into our failures. Again, a direct correlation. So his patient, calm, and collected strengths he was able to handle Republican obstructionism because of that. His education and his knowledge he was able to advance policies that maybe he wasn't, a less knowledgeable politician wouldn't have been able to contend. His strength would be his pragmatism, his realism, his reasonable nature. Got us out of the economic recovery by not acting brashly or too quickly. His communication skills and his personality, it certainly helped in pushing LGBTQ rights in the country and advancing them further. Certainly helped in diplomacy. He was well liked by many leaders throughout the world. His strengths, again, political maneuvering. Again, he was able to advance a lot of policies. Weaknesses: his lack of bipartisanship may have contributed to a slow economic recovery. His pragmatism, being too compromising, kind of led to some immigration policy contradictions. His short political resume may have contributed to his inability to bridge the political divide. His over-reliance on symbolism and not concrete, long-lasting legislative change is what ultimately led to a shaky legacy that is, a lot of his policies were quick to be reversed and changed forever. Or at least until a like-minded individual gets in, and they can reverse it back. And then finally, reliance on executive action, which is kind of what we've been talking about in the last few seconds. And so his policies were easily overturned. So here are my references, and I got quite a few of them. I hope you enjoyed my presentation on Barack Obama, and I am going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and end the meeting.